All right, Ryan. Well, we're back here. And this is a unique one because we are actually in the same place, not only the same city, but actually the same apartment, even though it might not look like it. And we're doing all of our viewers a favor by not having some weird audio by being in different rooms.
Yeah, maybe if I speak loud enough, the echo will pick up on your side.
I do hear you on the other side of the door, so we'll leave it that way. But more seriously, this is our first Facebook Live that we're doing since our Q2 forecast came out on Sunday evening. So you obviously played a big role in putting together our MENA forecast. But even aside from that, there have been a number of attacks in Israel the past 2 weeks that really seem to have taken precedence.
Right. Yeah. And it's unfortunate what's happening in Israel is that we've suddenly got these individual attacks, now three of them, that are really hard for the Israeli security forces to prevent, and that may presage a wider trend. And that's something that as Ramadan is happening as of tomorrow, and then Passover will be happening not long after that, and they'll be coinciding. Israeli security forces are on alert that there may be more of these kind of grassroots attacks, and it's such a tricky thing for Israel to deal with, and it's actually a tricky thing for the organized Palestinian factions to deal with, because there's not much you can do when an individual decides they're going to pick up a weapon and attack civilian or military targets. That's just one of those things that they have to endure and hope that it burns out on its own accord.
Well, and what's really been interesting about these attacks, or if one can call them interesting, is certainly distinctive, is at least two of them recently have been linked to Islamic State, one of which the group even explicitly claimed, and another conducted by a supporter who even tried to join the group last decade in Syria. Obviously, Islamic State has not really been able to get into Israel in a significant way, aside from some really sporadic incidents that have been a number of years ago.
Right. And it kind of gives us an idea of what the state of Islamic State is right now. It's more of an ideology, and beyond Syria and Iraq, where it still has organized cells, in most places, it's more of an idea. And especially in Israel, it's an idea that appears to now suddenly be inspiring attacks by Israeli Arabs. And we have to remind folks that Israeli Arabs are about 10% of Israel's population. They're full citizens. They vote. They have representatives in the Knesset. In fact, one of their parties is critical to holding together the government right now. So they're full citizens. And yet last year, during the Gaza war in May, there were the intercommunal riots. The Israeli Arabs and kind of far right Jewish groups were attacking each other in the streets, and that left a really bad taste in the mouth of both sides, and the wounds of that social discord, I don't think, have been healed completely. And now there is a risk that Islamic State ideology has seeped into some of these communities and is inspiring violence. And if that is the case, it's very hard for Israel to draw that out, because once that idea is in a disaffected community, it's really tough to deal with it, other than really hard-handed security crackdowns, the sort of thing that will just alienate Israeli Arabs more, or letting all of the supporters carry out their attacks and then be arrested or killed in the process, and sort of exhausting them that way. Both of those are not exactly, they're not options that Israel particularly wants to have to go with.
No, definitely not. And one of the things that you and I know have spoken about this past week or so has really been about the reaction from groups like Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, that are seen as the vanguard of the Palestinian resistance. But in this case, even though attacks are occurring against Israelis, they're not necessarily actually in favor of these for a variety of reasons, right?
Right, exactly. Like Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad are both benefiting from the ceasefire deal from last year that allows Qatari aid to go through Israel into the Gaza Strip. They want to keep that deal going, but Islamic State is a potential ideological rival. They're more radical than Hamas or PIJ, and both of them will react to the appearance of IS's ideology taking root inside of Palestinian communities. It will make them more violent, in other words, as they try to demonstrate that they are just as committed to the militant cause as the Islamic State. And so it pulls them in the direction of having to carry out military escalations that aren't really in their direct interest. And we got to remember last year, the conflict between them in May, there wasn't a clear victory for Hamas besides a propaganda victory. And that's still where they are right now. They're not going to be able to change the military situation against Israel. They might be able to gain a propaganda victory again, but this is a trickier one to get even a propaganda victory out of, because at this point it would look like they're the aggressors, as opposed to last year where it appeared that Israel was the aggressor that triggered that conflict. So they don't want to be dragged in this direction. But if it looks like IS is getting more and more support, they'll be moving towards escalation.
So we have this spate of attacks. We have the Islamic State involvement. We have Ramadan that is literally starting right now. We have upcoming Passover holiday in 2 weeks. We also have Easter. I mean, it really seems like you're throwing all of the concerning symbolism in the upcoming weeks. And while we don't want to be alarmist, we of course also want to scope out what are the scenarios that could escalate things again. I mean, it was only a year ago that we had, as you noted, an actual war in Gaza again. So not that we're saying that this is where it's going to end up. However, how would you forecast in terms of the scenarios for if it were to develop? What are kind of the triggers we should be looking for?
Well, like the underlying biggest risk is that the grassroots tensions between Israelis and Palestinians and Jews and Arabs, none of those tensions have been resolved from last year, and they've been building up even further. And that's kind of the fuel for the fire as we consider these scenarios. So perhaps the first easiest scenario to consider is that we continue to see individual attacks, but no organized actors like Hamas or Fatah get involved. So we see these individual attacks, we see Israeli police crackdowns, there is violence, there might be some intercommunal riots and protests in various places, but it doesn't escalate to a war scenario because the organized actors, as we were talking about before, they don't really have a victory game plan at the moment. The second scenario is that it starts to escalate into something of a more limited conflict scenario. And this is more likely in Gaza, where we could see Hamas and PIJ decide to carry out violent protests at the borders, try to provoke Israeli troops. We've seen that in the past. That's still short of a full-scale war, but that's something that they could decide to do if they want to take advantage of, or if they want to get out ahead of this anti-Israeli violent current that is emerging at the moment. And then the third scenario is returning to another conflict, a major conflict between Israel and Gaza. Even the possibility that within the West Bank, that the Palestinian security forces fail to control the unrest there, and we start to see that what looks like an intifada start to break out as an escalation ladder is climbed, as the Israeli police carry out crackdowns, and then Hamas retaliates for the crackdowns, and then Israel retaliates against Hamas, and then that escalates into a general war between Israel and Gaza, and then the West Bank's security situation deteriorates. And that's kind of our worst case scenario, is this prospect that this grassroots tensions climbs the escalation ladder and forces leaders to make choices that they wouldn't of their own accord.
Well, aside from all those concerning scenarios, you obviously did a lot of work putting together forecasts for the broader MENA region for the rest of the quarter. So outside of Israel, are there any particular hotspots that you think our viewers should be looking at for notable developments in the next 3 months?
Right, and we're definitely watching the U.S.-Iran nuclear talks, which remain, uncertain as to where they will land and when they will land. There's strong geopolitical incentives for both Iran and the United States to come to some kind of accord, but there's an awful lot of distrust between the two sides. There's an awful lot of politics on both sides, where internal factions are opposed to the accords for various reasons. And we're watching to see how those sorts of things play out, because even though it would benefit Iran to have sanctions relief, at least for a while, and it would benefit the United States to have an arms control agreement in the Middle East, at least for a while, there's plenty of internal actors on both sides that are saying that the deal isn't worth it or that it's not good enough. And then on top of that, of course, the deal will do nothing to resolve Israeli-Iranian tensions, Iranian Gulf Arab tensions, all of those that could potentially escalate into a bigger conflict with or without the deal. So I'd say that's one of our biggest ones that we're still watching through the quarter.
Yeah, and it's pretty wild, of course, to think that given the situation in Ukraine, that this issue, which for so long was top of mind for everybody, has really become secondary news, but is still absolutely being affected by the Russian invasion. I mean, even for the past 2 weeks, there have been a number of questions about what exactly the Russians are trying to seek from this deal. Are they going to throw a wrench into it? And it feels like every day there's kind of a back and forth between public officials and saying, oh, things look better, things look worse. And yet we're still, everybody seems to be like we're on the precipice of something, but we still haven't gotten any firm deal.
Right, exactly. And of course, the Russian angle also matters for the energy markets. If you can get an Iranian nuclear deal, you can start to get Iranian oil back onto the global supply. You can start to push down prices a bit, stabilize the market with the absence of Russian oil. That's also a big incentive for the U.S. and the West to try to get this deal done. At the same time, from Iran's domestic political standpoint, many of these hardliners that are now in power, they have weathered sanctions for years now. And they feel like this is a moment where, if the West is so desperate for oil, this is a moment for them to try to assert their leverage over them and get more concessions while they can.
Yeah, it's one of these just truly, from a kind of intellectual point of view, really interesting ways in which all of these crises actually do have very clear impacts on one another, even though they're about completely separate issues.
Right.
So I guess I'm wondering, obviously surveying the landscape, there are plenty of other places we could talk about. What's the one other issue you think our viewers should really be paying attention to?
Well, we're also monitoring. This is kind of a good news story to an extent.
Yes, please give us some good news in the Middle East.
Something that's relatively positive is Turkey's foreign policy has taken a warming turn. And we've seen that actually, even as we were talking about Israel earlier, just today, President Erdogan called the Israeli president to condemn the attacks on Israelis. And that's a big shift for Erdogan's foreign policy, because Turkey is trying to reach out to its former rivals to rebuild relations, get economic relations going, get trade going, get investment going, because the Turkish economy, for lack of a better word, kind of sucks right now.
And that's probably being a diplomatic word, by the way.
That's the nicest way I can put it at the moment. But Turkey's inflation is over 50%, and many outside observers see that as a self-inflicted wound from the way that the ruling Justice and Development Party governs the economy. But that being said, their strategy is not to change their domestic policies, but rather for Ankara to reach out to Saudi Arabia, UAE, Israel, Egypt, and try to mend fences and try to bring down the boiling point within the region, and step back from the confrontations that they were having in the past to restore some of these ties that they've lost, and hopefully for the AKP, turn that into economic dividends.
All right. Well, I definitely want to use a good news story to end, because you can't say that all the time, unfortunately, in the Middle East. But Ryan, if our viewers want to know where they can go to see our forecasts, to get our information, where should they be going?
They should be checking out www.stratfor.com or stratforworldview.com, and seeing our latest analysis.
All right. Well, we'll leave it there. Let's leave with some good news, and we hope everybody has a nice weekend.